that leads us into probably the most famous part of the Smith story, which is the Pocahontas story, which is controversial in many ways, but it's also extremely interesting in the fact that it exists, the fact that it really only began to be told during his second version of these events in general history. It's not in true relation, and so that, in a way, makes it pretty interesting. It's mentioned that he gets away at the first time, but it really goes into more detail in the second description. It's really the first great American adventure tale, but in a lot of ways, it's a repetition. There's a version, a very similar story that's told through a translation of a Spanish soldier that appears in one of the English author Richard Hakluyt's works. That's virtually the same thing, the same possible ceremony. So there's a question of whether it's true or not. Whether or not it's true, it's that can be argued, and we'll look at some of the arguments for and against here in a minute. But the thing about it is that it does exist, and what does it mean? For those of us today, we think about the Pocahontas story as being this sort of romance and this fairy tale. And historically, it wasn't like that at all. Smith did not have a romance with Pocahontas. Pocahontas later marries another English settler named John Rolfe, but there's no indication that there's any sort of romantic connection between them at all. If anything, Smith looks at this and sees this as proof positive that the Europeans are superior. They're superior to such an extent that the Native Americans recognize this and will sacrifice themselves in a way to protect this superiority. That Pocahontas is the one who sees these are our betters. These are the people who are going to come in and take over. So we need to protect them. We need to show that we are their subjects. Whereas it appears that Powhatan is still living in the old paradigm, that he's the ruler of the area and the ruler of that world, whereas Pocahontas seems to be the realist who sees things differently. In other sections of Smith's narrative that we don't have in the textbook, there's a second rescue that Pocahontas undertakes to save Smith from an ambush that makes it even more clear that Pocahontas is really sort of playing towards the English side, that she sees their victory really as inevitable. And that's really what her collaboration is about. It's about really seeing reality. It's a bit of what they call realpolitik. Some of the arguments against the Smith-Pocahontas story being true include that Smith did not include the story in True Relation, which was the first book that he published about his experiences in Virginia. And the argument that he includes it in history to promote himself more as a hero. That at that time he had returned from the New World. He was seeing himself more as an author and as sort of a self-mythologizing hero. And that basically he took the Hakluyt story and incorporated it into his own story. Another argument against its at least what it really meant, was that this was some sort of Native American adoption ceremony that he may have really misunderstood. That him being thrown down and sort of the mock execution that takes place is actually a Native American adoption ceremony, initiation ritual. And there's some documentation that ritual does exist, maybe not exactly in that form. So that is a distinct possibility that might actually have been the case. Some of the arguments for it being true is that it is mentioned briefly in one of his other works, even though it doesn't go into a lot of detail. It's not necessarily something that Smith was extremely proud of or bragged about. You'll notice in the section of your reading that it appears in, it's really kind of gone through very quickly. There's not a lot of detail about it. It mentions his captivity and rescue, possibly because he anticipates they might be used by his opponents. As I said, he was tried and he was accused of the wrongful death of some of the men that were traveling with him at the time. So he may have wanted to bring it up so that he could show, I really was in danger. I was really close to death. I wasn't collaborating with the enemy. I'm not responsible for the deaths of these other people. I could just as well have been killed as well. Another thing is it's also included in works by others, letters, later narratives include the story. And, of course, the second rescue, which I mentioned is not in the textbook, but also took place where Pocahontas saves Smith from an ambush, that has many witnesses, and it really establishes the relationship between Pocahontas and Smith. Now, finally, the last thing I had you read by Smith was a description of New England. Now, the reason it's important is that it really is sort of Smith's sales pitch. And it can be looked at as the model by which later settlements followed. Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth Colony. You can tell that they read Description of New England because they see how this could be done. And very clearly and specifically, Smith lays it out. In the last few paragraphs particularly, pay close attention to how he lays out, this is what you need to have in a settlement to make it work as a legitimate colony. You need to have men and women who are eager to make it in life that didn't have the opportunity back in old Europe. You need to have people with trades. You need to have farmers and fishermen and blacksmiths. You need to have all the people that you need to make a real settlement, a real self-sufficient colony. Those are the things that he didn't necessarily have in Jamestown, the things that they were really wanting in the early stages of the Virginia colony. And he puts that in Description of New England. Finally, Smith's significance, again, it can't be understated. He is the author of the first book written in America. He writes general history when he is there. Part of it while he is imprisoned, part of it while he's convalescing from getting basically some friendly fire or possibly getting fragged. It's arguable as to what exactly happened, but he was injured with a gunpowder explosion. He introduces the myth of the noble and remediable savage, that Powhatan, about Pocahontas particularly, as being someone who is good and helpful and smart. There's an emphasis on chivalry, on adventure, and on the resources of America, especially in Description of New England, how bountiful New England is. Another thing about the significance is just really the complexity of it, the problems with the storytelling, the fact versus fiction, the myth-making versus the plain-speaking, the ordinary versus the exotic. They're all there in Smith, and it makes it exciting to read because you're really trying to suss out what the truth is from the way this man sees the truth. Christian faith and morality. Smith is not an overly religious person, but as I said with Harriet, everyone at that time was very much grounded in religion. It was part of their lives. It was part of the way they saw the world. Liberty and opportunity. Smith talks about that again in Description of New England, about how this is a place where you can come and you can make a life for yourself a way that you couldn't do back in the old world. It's important to be prepared. He specifically states out, what you need in America to be able to thrive and survive. And this idea of being a hard worker and an individualist. That you have to put your shoulder to the grindstone, your nose to the grindstone, your shoulder to the wheel, and that it doesn't matter who you are or where you come from, you have to work equally hard. And that's the thing that Smith understands that a lot of the other people that were part of the Jamestown colony didn't understand. And the reason it took so long for the Jamestown colony to become successful was basically because of that. And that's how Smith was able to rise above. And that's something that later colonists really learned from.